Former Navy SEAL Senior Chief Petty Officer Cole Bennett woke at 0545 hours on a warm Saturday morning in his Charlotte, North Carolina suburb, the persistent ringing in his right ear already announcing itself before consciousness fully returned. The tinnitus, a constant companion since the vehicle-borne IED attack in Iraq 2 years prior, was particularly aggressive this morning, a high-pitched whine that no amount of concentration could silence. Cole had learned to live with it, the same way he'd learned to live with the traumatic brain injury that had ended his 16-year SEAL career, and the PTSD that made civilian life feel like navigating hostile territory without armor or backup. At 38, Cole had spent more of his adult life in the teams than out of them, and the medical retirement following the IED blast felt less like transition and more like exile from the only family and purpose he'd ever truly known. The blast had killed 2 teammates instantly and left Cole with moderate traumatic brain injury, partial hearing loss in his right ear requiring a hearing aid, and PTSD symptoms that the VA psychiatrist described as severe but manageable with appropriate treatment and support. Research showed significant overlap between TBI and PTSD symptoms. Both conditions caused sleep problems, memory difficulties, concentration issues, irritability, anxiety, mood changes, and challenges with daily functioning. Studies indicated that veterans who experienced TBI during deployment had nearly twice the probability of developing PTSD compared to those without head injuries, because the traumatic events causing brain injuries were themselves emotionally devastating, and because TBI could damage brain areas that processed fear memories, making PTSD symptoms worse. More than 485,500 military personnel were diagnosed with TBI between 2000 and 2023, with at least 20% of post-9/11 veterans carrying a TBI diagnosis. The prevalence of mental health disorders among veterans with mild TBI ranged from 50–78%, with PTSD rates at 45%, creating what experts called the signature wounds of modern warfare. Cole now worked as a consultant for corporate security firms, using his SEAL training and tactical expertise to assess vulnerabilities and design protection protocols for executives and facilities. The work paid well and allowed him to maintain limited hours that accommodated the cognitive fatigue and memory issues his TBI caused, symptoms that included headaches, confusion, slowed thinking, trouble with decision-making, and the need for frequent breaks to process complex information. His constant companion and lifeline was Ranger, a 5-year-old German Shepherd who served as Cole's medical alert service dog. Ranger had been trained through a specialized program pairing veterans with service dogs specifically for TBI and PTSD support. Over 18 months of intensive training, Ranger had learned to detect when Cole's stress levels spiked toward panic attacks, recognizing elevated heart rate, changing breathing patterns, and muscle tension that preceded PTSD episodes, and to provide deep pressure therapy by leaning his 70-pound frame against Cole's leg or chest, grounding him before symptoms overwhelmed his capacity to function. Ranger also alerted Cole to sounds he couldn't hear due to his partial hearing loss. Doorbells, phone rings, approaching vehicles, people calling his name. The dog's presence meant Cole could navigate public spaces with confidence rather than the constant hypervigilance and anxiety that had initially made leaving his apartment feel like walking point on patrol without intel or support. This particular Saturday morning routine included breakfast at Java Junction, a small independent coffee shop where Cole had been a regular for 8 months. The owner, Maria Santos, a former army medic who understood invisible wounds and service dog partnerships, had created an environment where Cole felt safe rather than scrutinized. The predictability helped manage his PTSD. Same corner seat facing the door, providing clear sightlines to all entrances and exits. Old SEAL habits that civilian life hadn't diminished. Same black coffee order. Same understanding that Ranger wasn't a pet, but medical equipment as essential as Cole's hearing aid. Maria never questioned Ranger's presence, never asked what Cole's disability was, never treated him differently because of visible markers of injury. The hearing aid, the service dog, the occasional moments when anxiety attacks made Cole need to step outside for air and grounding. She simply provided consistent, respectful service and a safe space where a broken warrior could drink coffee without judgment or interrogation. The morning waitress was Sophie Chen, 22 years old, a pre-med student working to pay for her education while caring for her younger brother after their parents died in a car accident 2 years earlier. Cole had watched Sophie work over months with quiet admiration. She was competent despite juggling multiple responsibilities, kind to customers regardless of their demeanor, remembered regulars' orders, and treated everyone with respect regardless of their circumstances or disabilities. She was one of the few servers who acknowledged Ranger appropriately. A quick smile at the dog, but no attempts to pet, distract, or interfere with him while he was working, showing the understanding that service dogs weren't social pets, but medical equipment their handlers depended upon. At 8:15 hours, Cole entered Java Junction with Ranger at his side, wearing his clearly marked service dog vest, identifying him as a working medical alert animal. The cafe was moderately busy with Saturday morning customers, families ordering pastries, couples reading newspapers over lattes, regulars like Cole maintaining weekend routines. Cole took his usual corner booth, Ranger settling quietly underneath with the practiced discipline of a working service dog trained to be unobtrusive while remaining alert to his handler's needs. At a table near the counter sat 2 uniformed Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department officers. Name tags identified them as Officers Derek Hoffman and Marcus Webb, who Cole's SEAL-trained threat assessment immediately recognized as problematic based on their body language and interaction patterns. Loud voices carried across the small cafe, demanding tone towards Sophie, treating her with obvious condescension and the entitled superiority of people using authority to dominate those they perceived as beneath them in the social hierarchy. Over the 15 minutes, Cole observed while reviewing notes for upcoming security consultations. The officers escalated their complaints systematically. The coffee was too cold. It wasn't. Cole had watched Sophie pour it fresh. The muffins weren't fresh enough. They'd been delivered that morning. Sophie was taking too long with refills. She was managing 4 other tables during morning rush. The background music was too loud. It was set at the same volume it always was. Each complaint was delivered with theatrical disgust designed to humiliate and assert dominance rather than address legitimate service issues. When Sophie brought fresh coffee after the temperature complaint, Officer Hoffman inspected it with exaggerated care. "This is still not hot enough. What kind of operation is this? We're law enforcement officers. We deserve quality service, not the garbage you're serving. Do you understand who we are and what we do for this community?" Sophie apologized profusely, despite having just poured the coffee from a fresh pot Cole could see was steaming, offered to make a completely new pot immediately. Officer Webb added complaints with cruel condescension. And she forgot my sugar again. Typical incompetence from people who can't handle basic tasks. We protect this community and risk our lives every day. And this is the respect we get from people like you. Sophie rushed to address their manufactured demands, clearly stressed by the hostile confrontation, her hands shaking slightly as she retrieved sugar and prepared yet another fresh pot of coffee. Cole watched from his corner booth, his own PTSD symptoms increasing from the aggressive voices and confrontational energy filling the small cafe. His heart rate elevated. Vision began the familiar tunnel narrowing. Breathing required conscious control. But Ranger remained calm beside him, alert to Cole's rising tension, and the dog positioned himself against Cole's leg, providing the calming pressure that helped Cole manage the anxiety these confrontational situations triggered. When Sophie returned with fresh, steaming hot coffee and additional sugar, Officer Hoffman tested the temperature with exaggerated theatricality. Finally, this is actually hot. Maybe you're learning how to do your job properly. But as Sophie turned to attend to another table's order, Officer Webb did something that transformed harassment into criminal assault. He deliberately picked up his full cup of scalding coffee. Cole could see steam rising from it, even from 20 feet away, and threw it directly at Sophie's back and neck, the hot liquid splashing across her exposed skin in a sustained throw that covered her shoulders and upper back. Sophie screamed, a sound of genuine pain and shock that cut through the cafe's morning atmosphere, and collapsed to her knees, clutching her neck and shoulders where the near-boiling coffee had already caused visible burns, blistering starting immediately, the kind of second-degree burns that would require emergency medical treatment and potentially leave permanent scarring. Both officers laughed, actual, genuine laughter, at a young woman they just deliberately burned with scalding liquid. Officer Hoffman added loudly enough for everyone in the cafe to hear. Maybe that'll teach you to pay better attention to officer requests. When cops ask for service, you move faster and show proper respect. Consider that on-the-job training for working in the real world. Sophie was sobbing, other customers frozen in shock, and Maria rushed from behind the counter towards Sophie's position. But nobody confronted the officers. These were uniformed police with visible weapons, authority figures who just committed obvious assault and were laughing about it. The power differential was so stark that even outraged witnesses hesitated to challenge armed law enforcement, who clearly believed their badges exempted them from consequences for criminal behavior. That's when Cole's SEAL training overrode his deliberate civilian avoidance of confrontation and his careful management of PTSD triggers that could overwhelm his already compromised cognitive function. Ranger immediately alerted to Cole's sharply elevated stress, moving into position to provide pressure and grounding. But Cole was already moving toward Sophie with the controlled, tactical movement of someone who'd spent 16 years operating in hostile environments where hesitation cost lives. He knelt beside Sophie, gently examining her burns with the medical assessment skills every SEAL learned. Second-degree burns across her neck, shoulders, and upper back, blistering already forming across approximately 15% of her upper body surface area, the kind of injury requiring immediate medical attention and potentially skin grafts to minimize scarring and prevent infection. He looked directly at Officers Hoffman and Webb with the calm, unflinching gaze that 16 years of command presence had perfected. "You just committed felony assault on a civilian," Cole said, with the quiet authority of 16 years of military service, despite Ranger pressing against him to manage his PTSD response and help him maintain control. "You deliberately threw scalding coffee at her, causing serious burns requiring emergency medical treatment. That's assault inflicting serious injury under North Carolina General Statute 1433. You did it while on duty, in uniform, using your position as law enforcement to create fear of retaliation that prevented her from defending herself. That's abuse of authority. I witnessed the entire incident from beginning to end. So did everyone else in this cafe. At least 5 people recorded it on their phones." Officer Webb stood aggressively, hand moving toward his service weapon in an unconscious intimidation gesture designed to establish dominance. "Who the hell do you think you are? You threatening police officers? We'll arrest you for obstruction of justice and intimidation of law enforcement." Cole didn't move, didn't flinch, Ranger maintaining perfect controlled position, despite Cole's elevated stress levels making the dog's medical support essential to keeping him functional. "I'm retired Navy SEAL Senior Chief Cole Bennett. This is Ranger, my registered medical alert service dog for PTSD and hearing loss from combat injuries sustained in Iraq. I'm not threatening anyone. I'm documenting a felony assault I witnessed you commit against an unarmed civilian. You deliberately threw scalding coffee at a waitress doing her job, causing serious burns visible to everyone here. Multiple witnesses, video evidence from at least 6 phones I counted. Your badge doesn't protect you from assault laws or basic human decency." Officer Hoffman tried different intimidation tactics, pointing at Ranger. "That was an accident. She bumped into Webb while he was drinking. Besides, your dog shouldn't even be in a food service establishment. That's a health code violation. We could cite this business and have it shut down for violations." Cole's response was delivered with SEAL precision, despite his PTSD symptoms making his hands shake and his breathing require conscious control. "It wasn't an accident." Officer Webb deliberately picked up his full cup with both hands, looked directly at her back, and threw the entire contents at her while making verbal statements about teaching lessons and on-the-job training. That's intentional infliction of serious bodily harm, which elevates this from simple assault to assault inflicting serious injury, a Class A1 misdemeanor or Class H felony, depending on final injury assessment under North Carolina General Statute 1433C. Ranger is a federally protected service dog under the Americans with Disabilities Act Title III, specifically trained for medical alert work for combat-related disabilities, including traumatic brain injury and PTSD, clearly marked with service dog identification visible on his vest, and legally permitted in all public accommodations, including food service establishments under federal law. Your threat to cite health code violations to intimidate a disabled combat veteran with a service dog is itself a violation of ADA provisions protecting service animal access and constitutes retaliation against a witness to your assault. Maria called 911 while Cole retrieved the first aid kit he always carried, a habit from SEAL training adapted to civilian life, and began providing emergency treatment for Sophie's burns, cool water to stop the burning process, sterile gauze to protect the injured skin, careful assessment for shock symptoms. Ranger divided his attention between monitoring Cole's stress levels and providing calming presence for Sophie's trauma, the dog's training including comfort for others in crisis situations. The 2 officers realized the situation was comprehensively documented by multiple witnesses and involved a highly credible military veteran who just cited specific legal statutes from memory with obvious expertise. They attempted to leave before additional law enforcement arrived to investigate their crime. Cole blocked their path to the exit, not physically, but with command presence amplified by Ranger's alert positioning. The service dog recognizing threat to his handler and moving into protective stance. "You're not leaving. You committed felony assault on a civilian while on duty in uniform. Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department has been called by 911 dispatch. You'll remain here to provide statements to responding supervisors and internal affairs investigators. Leaving the scene of a crime you committed while in uniform compounds your violations with obstruction of justice, witness intimidation, and fleeing to avoid prosecution. Charlotte Mecklenburg. Police Department supervisors arrived with internal affairs investigators within 9 minutes. The rapid response suggesting the 911 dispatcher had recognized the explosive nature of the call. On-duty officers accused of felony assault on a civilian witnessed by a decorated military veteran with service dog. Cole provided his witness statement using SEAL operational reporting standards, despite the cognitive demands taxing his TBI-compromised processing. Comprehensive timeline with specific timestamps, exact legal violations with statute citations, complete witness list with contact information for follow-up, locations of video evidence on customer phones and cafe security cameras. Sophie receiving treatment from paramedics for second-degree burns, covering approximately 15% of her neck, shoulders, and upper back, provided her account through pain and shock, describing months of increasingly aggressive behavior from these same two officers whenever they came into Java Junction, escalating complaints designed to humiliate her in front of other customers, and today's deliberate burning that had crossed from harassment into assault, causing injury requiring hospitalization and potentially permanent scarring. Maria Santos, the cafe owner and former Army medic, confirmed the absolutely deliberate nature of the coffee throwing. She'd witnessed Officer Webb lift the cup with both hands, look directly at Sophie's back, and throw in a sustained action while Sophie was turned away, attending to another table, making it impossible to be accidental. 9 other customers provided written statements and video footage showing Officers Webb and Hoffman laughing after burning Sophie, with Hoffman's recorded statement about on-the-job training, demonstrating consciousness of wrongdoing rather than accident. Officers Hoffman and Webb claimed in their statements that it was an unfortunate accident, that Sophie had turned unexpectedly, that Webb was gesturing while talking, and the coffee spilled accidentally, and critically, that Cole was an unstable veteran with severe PTSD and traumatic brain injury, making false accusations to undermine law enforcement because his mental illness and cognitive impairment made him prone to paranoia and misinterpreting normal interactions as threats. Officer Hoffman's statement specifically argued, "This veteran clearly has severe disabilities. He admitted himself he has PTSD and traumatic brain injury requiring a service dog and hearing aid. Research shows people with his conditions have distorted perceptions of reality, memory problems, and tendency to see threats where none exist. His testimony is inherently unreliable due to documented mental illness and brain damage." Internal Affairs investigators reviewed the video evidence that evening. Crystal clear footage from 3 different phone cameras and Java Junction's security system showing Officer Webb deliberately lifting his cup with both hands, looking directly at Sophie's exposed back and neck, and throwing the entire contents in a sustained 3-second throw while she was turned away, followed by both officers laughing as Sophie screamed and collapsed, clutching her burned neck. The evidence was incontrovertible. Deliberate felony assault captured from multiple angles, with audio recording Hoffman's statement about teaching lessons and on-the-job training. Both officers were immediately placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Their badges and service weapons surrendered, restrictions placed on contact with the victim or witnesses. Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department issued a brief public statement. "We take all allegations of officer misconduct extremely seriously and are conducting a thorough investigation into this incident with full transparency and accountability. But within 72 hours, the outcome shattered any illusion of accountability or transparency," CMPD announced. "After thorough investigation by our Internal Affairs Division and review of all available evidence, Officers Derek Hoffman and Marcus Webb have been cleared of criminal wrongdoing. The incident was determined to be an unfortunate accident with no malicious intent or criminal behavior. Both officers have expressed sincere regret for the accident and will undergo additional community relations and customer service training before returning to full-duty status next week with written reprimands in their personnel files." The decision ignited immediate outrage throughout Charlotte. Sophie had second-degree burns requiring ongoing medical treatment, specialized wound care at burn treatment centers, potential skin grafts to minimize permanent scarring, physical therapy to maintain range of motion in her neck and shoulders, psychological trauma counseling, and tens of thousands of dollars in medical bills she couldn't possibly afford on a waitress and pre-med student's income. Video evidence clearly showed deliberate assault, not an accident. 9 independent witnesses confirmed it wasn't accidental. Yet the police department had protected its own, using internal investigation to shield officers from criminal prosecution that any civilian would face for identical actions. Local media began investigating after receiving leaked video from witnesses outraged by the clearance. The footage went viral within 24 hours. Uniformed Charlotte Mecklenburg police officers deliberately burning a young waitress with scalding coffee while laughing, then being cleared by their own department despite overwhelming evidence of deliberate felony assault. Public pressure mounted rapidly, but CMPD Chief Jonathan Martinez stood firm. "Our investigation was thorough, professional, and reached the correct conclusion based on all available evidence. This matter is closed. Our officers acted appropriately, and any claims otherwise are unfounded attacks on law enforcement." Cole made a decision that required confronting every PTSD trigger and cognitive challenge his traumatic brain injury imposed. His VA therapist warned explicitly that pursuing this would likely cause severe symptom spikes, increased anxiety attacks, worsening tinnitus, cognitive fatigue, memory problems, potential regression in treatment progress, and risk the fragile stability he'd spent 2 years building through intensive therapy and Rangers' medical support. But Cole couldn't accept the outcome, not when it meant law enforcement officers could deliberately assault civilians causing serious injury and face zero consequences because the system designed to hold them accountable instead protected its own. He organized comprehensive response using SEAL operational planning skills adapted for civilian advocacy, coordinated with civil rights attorneys who took Sophie's case pro bono after reviewing video evidence showing obvious felony assault, contacted investigative journalists at state and national media outlets with complete documentation, including video, witness statements, and medical records. Connected with veteran advocacy organizations who recognize this as abuse of authority, witnessed and documented by a disabled combat veteran being weaponized against him. Filed formal complaints with the North Carolina Attorney General's Office and U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division about CMPD's internal investigation constituting obstruction of justice, denial of civil rights, and pattern of clearing officers despite evidence of misconduct. The situation escalated dramatically when officers Hoffman and Webb, emboldened by being cleared and facing zero consequences for deliberate felony assault, returned to Java Junction in full uniform 2 weeks after the assault, a calculated intimidation tactic demonstrating they could burn Sophie and not only avoid punishment but return to the scene of their crime to further intimidate their victim while armed and in uniform representing the authority of law enforcement. Cole had anticipated exactly this possibility and increased his presence at Java Junction specifically to protect Sophie, arriving early each morning and staying through breakfast and lunch rush hours. When the two cleared officers entered at 08:30 hours on a Saturday morning, 2 weeks after the assault, Ranger immediately alerted to Cole's sharply spiking anxiety. The dog recognized elevated heart rate, rapidly changing breathing patterns, and muscle tension that preceded full panic attacks, moving into position to provide deep pressure therapy by leaning his full 70-pound weight against Cole's leg. Officer Webb addressed Cole directly across the cafe, loud enough for everyone to hear in what was clearly rehearsed intimidation. "Still hanging around here with your PTSD dog and your mental problems? Thought maybe you'd learn to mind your own business by now and focus on your own issues. We were cleared by a thorough professional investigation. That means we did nothing wrong. It was an accident, and anyone who says otherwise is either lying or too mentally ill to understand reality. Maybe you should focus on managing your own brain damage and mental illness instead of harassing hard-working police officers just trying to do our jobs protecting the community." Cole stood slowly, Ranger immediately rising with him and pressing close, the service dog's trained response to his handler's severe stress providing the physical grounding that kept Cole functional despite PTSD symptoms and TBI-related cognitive strain threatening to overwhelm him. His response was delivered despite visible trembling in his hands that Ranger's pressure helped minimize. Being cleared by your own department's internal investigation doesn't mean you did nothing wrong. It means your department values protecting officers over accountability to the citizens you're supposed to serve and protect. You deliberately threw scalding coffee at Sophie Chen while she was working, causing second-degree burns requiring emergency medical treatment, ongoing specialized wound care, and potentially permanent scarring. That's documented fact, supported by video evidence from multiple camera angles and 9 independent witness statements. The North Carolina Attorney General's Office and U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division are both currently reviewing CMPD's investigation for potential obstruction of justice, civil rights violations, and pattern of misconduct. Your attempt to intimidate Sophie by returning here in uniform while armed is witness intimidation under North Carolina General Statute 14-2226, which carries penalties up to 12 months imprisonment. You're actively compounding your original felony assault violations with additional crimes. The confrontation drew immediate media attention. Investigative journalists from local television stations and newspapers had been monitoring the case closely and were staked out near Java Junction, anticipating exactly this kind of intimidation attempt. Local news crews filmed the two cleared officers attempting to intimidate their assault victim, while a disabled combat veteran with a PTSD service dog visibly struggling with anxiety symptoms defended her using specific legal citations and calm authority despite obvious distress requiring his service dog's active medical intervention. The optics were absolutely devastating for Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department and Chief Martinez's claims of appropriate conduct. Uniformed officers with badges and guns harassing a young waitress they deliberately burned with scalding coffee, laughing at a decorated military veteran whose service dog was providing visible, active medical support for PTSD and traumatic brain injury symptoms. Their intimidation tactics were deliberately triggering, behaving with complete impunity because internal investigation had shielded them from any consequences that civilians would face for identical criminal conduct. Public pressure reached critical mass when the video footage and witness statements went national, picked up by major news networks, civil rights organizations, and veteran advocacy groups. The North Carolina Attorney General's office announced independent investigation into both the original assault and CMPD's handling of the internal investigation. Federal prosecutors from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division opened formal inquiry into potential civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and pattern or practice of excessive force and misconduct. Video evidence reviewed by prosecutors outside Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department, the exact same footage Internal Affairs had claimed showed an accident, led to criminal charges filed by the Attorney General's office. Officer Marcus Webb charged with assault inflicting serious injury, Class A1 misdemeanor to Class H felony, assault with a deadly weapon, the scalding coffee, abuse of authority while on duty, and witness intimidation. Officer Derek Hoffman charged as accessory after the fact for his laughter and encouragement, failure to intervene to prevent fellow officer from committing felony assault, conspiracy to obstruct justice for coordinated false statements claiming the assault was accidental, and witness intimidation for the return to Java Junction. The criminal trial of Officers Hoffman and Webb became a watershed moment for law, enforcement accountability, and the systemic abuse of authority that internal investigation processes routinely protect when officers police themselves. Officer Marcus Webb's defense team argued strenuously that throwing scalding coffee at Sophie Chen had been a complete accident, that his hand had slipped while gesturing during conversation, that the whole incident was unfortunate but absolutely not criminal conduct deserving prosecution. The prosecution systematically dismantled that defensive narrative with overwhelming evidence. Video footage from 3 independent phone cameras and Java Junction's security system showing Webb lifting his cup with both hands in a controlled manner, looking directly at Sophie's exposed back and neck, and throwing the entire contents in a deliberate 3-second sustained action while she was turned completely away, attending to another table, making accidental contact physically impossible. Audio recordings captured Officer Hoffman's statement about teaching lessons and on-the-job training, demonstrating both officers' consciousness of deliberate wrongdoing rather than accident. Cole testified as the primary civilian witness, describing exactly what he'd observed with the detailed precision and credibility of 16 years of military training in observational skills, tactical assessment, and after-action reporting. The defense attempted aggressively to undermine his credibility by emphasizing his PTSD diagnosis, traumatic brain injury, need for a service dog, and hearing aid, arguing that mental illness and brain damage made his perception fundamentally unreliable and his testimony worthless. The prosecution's response was devastating and became legal precedent. Mr. Cole Bennett's PTSD and traumatic brain injury resulted from 16 years serving this country as a Navy SEAL, including the vehicle-borne IED attack in Iraq that killed 2 of his teammates and ended his military career when he sustained injuries, saving others. His service dog Ranger helps him manage symptoms that resulted directly from that honorable service. His PTSD diagnosis doesn't affect his observational skills, memory of events, or credibility as a witness. It affects his ability to function in high-stress situations without medical support, which is exactly why Ranger provides trained medical intervention for anxiety and sensory challenges. Research shows that veterans with TBI and PTSD often have heightened awareness and threat assessment capabilities from combat training. The defense is attempting to weaponize combat-related disabilities against a decorated veteran to protect law enforcement officers who committed felony assault on an unarmed civilian. This court should reject that offensive strategy and recognize that disability doesn't diminish credibility. It reflects sacrifice in service to country. Sophie testified about the burns that had required 3 weeks of intensive wound care at specialized burn treatment centers, skin grafts to minimize permanent scarring on visible areas of her neck and shoulders, months of physical therapy to maintain full range of motion, psychological trauma counseling for anxiety around authority figures and uniformed personnel, tens of thousands of dollars in medical bills, creating debt she couldn't afford, and the ongoing trauma of being deliberately hurt by people in positions of authority who then faced no consequences because the system designed to hold them accountable instead protected them from justice. 9 additional witnesses confirmed the assault was absolutely deliberate, not accidental. Multiple angles showing impossible physics for accidental spill. Both officers' laughter demonstrating consciousness of wrongdoing. Hoffman's recorded statements about teaching lessons, proving intent to harm rather than accident. Medical experts testified about the severity and permanence of Sophie's injuries, second-degree burns across 15% of upper body requiring extensive treatment, permanent scarring despite skin grafts, ongoing sensitivity and pain, psychological trauma from deliberate assault by authority figures. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours before returning verdicts. Officer Marcus Webb, guilty on all counts, assault inflicting serious injury, assault with a deadly weapon, abuse of authority while on duty, witness intimidation. Officer Derek Hoffman, guilty of accessory after the fact, failure to intervene to prevent felony assault by fellow officer, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and witness intimidation. Sentencing came 3 weeks later, with the courtroom packed with supporters for Sophie and outraged community members demanding accountability. Webb received 12 months in North Carolina State Prison, followed by 3 years supervised probation, permanent ban from law enforcement employment in North Carolina, and any state with reciprocal agreements, and restitution for Sophie's medical expenses. Hoffman received 6 months in county jail, followed by 3 years supervised probation, permanent law enforcement ban, and restitution obligations. The CMPD chief, who'd cleared them based on internal investigation, faced federal civil rights investigation that ended his 30-year law enforcement career. Though he avoided criminal charges by cooperating fully with investigators, implementing court-ordered reforms, and publicly acknowledging the internal investigation, had failed to serve justice or accountability. Sophie's civil lawsuit against the City of Charlotte and Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department settled for $500,000 covering all medical costs, including future treatments, lost wages from work, and educational opportunities missed during recovery, pain, and suffering compensation. Punitive damages for deliberate assault by law enforcement officers, and educational expenses supporting her medical school aspirations. The settlement included unprecedented provisions, public acknowledgement that the internal investigation had been inadequate and failed to serve justice, agreement to implement comprehensive reforms including mandatory independent investigation protocols for any assault allegations against on-duty officers, creation of civilian oversight board with subpoena power to review internal affairs investigations, and funding for community programs addressing law enforcement accountability and service worker protections. The broader systemic impact extended far beyond the individual case and Charlotte. The North Carolina Attorney General's office, responding to overwhelming public outcry and evidence that police departments routinely protected officers from accountability for misconduct through biased internal investigations, clearing officers at rates exceeding 95%, implemented mandatory independent investigation protocols statewide for any assault allegations against on-duty law enforcement officers. Under the new protocols, Internal Affairs could conduct preliminary fact-gathering, but any case involving potential criminal charges required automatic review by prosecutors from outside the officer's jurisdiction, and any case involving serious injury required mandatory referral to the Attorney General's Office for independent prosecution decisions. The case became required training material for police academies throughout North Carolina and eventually nationwide on abuse of authority, the critical importance of accountability over protecting fellow officers from consequences, recognizing that badges and uniforms don't exempt anyone from basic human decency or criminal law, and understanding that protecting bad officers undermines public trust and endangers good officers trying to serve with honor. Cole was invited to speak at several police academy graduations and law enforcement conferences about the responsibility that comes with authority, the courage required to hold those in power accountable when they abuse it, and the reality that veterans with PTSD and TBI deserved respect, rather than having their combat-related disabilities weaponized against them when they witnessed and reported misconduct. Sophie completed her pre-med undergraduate education with honors, supported by scholarship funds established by outraged community members, veteran organizations, and civil rights advocates who'd watched the video footage and wanted to ensure the young woman who'd been deliberately assaulted didn't lose her educational dreams to medical debt and trauma. She was accepted to medical school with full scholarship, became a powerful advocate for service worker protections and workplace violence prevention, and testified before the North Carolina State Legislature about the epidemic of customer assaults on service workers and the unique vulnerability when perpetrators are authority figures civilians fear confronting because of power differentials and potential retaliation. Cole continued his corporate security consulting work and expanded his advocacy for disabled veterans, particularly around service dog rights, PTSD accommodations, and combating the weaponization of combat-related disabilities to undermine veterans' credibility as witnesses or employees. He partnered with organizations training service dogs for veterans with TBI and PTSD, sharing his experience with Ranger and advocating for increased funding and access to service dog programs that research showed significantly reduced symptoms and enabled independent functioning. 1 year after the assault, Cole and Sophie spoke together at a National Law Enforcement Accountability and Civil Rights Conference, with Ranger lying calmly at Cole's feet, providing the ongoing support that made public speaking manageable despite crowds and attention triggering PTSD symptoms, requiring active medical intervention from his service dog. Asked by a civil rights attorney why he'd intervened, despite the severe PTSD triggers and cognitive demands his traumatic brain injury imposed, knowing it would cause symptom spikes requiring weeks of recovery, Cole's answer became foundational text for police accountability reform and veteran advocacy. Research shows that approximately 80% of police misconduct complaints are handled through internal investigations that clear officers at rates exceeding 95%, creating institutional culture where badge-carrying criminals believe they're completely untouchable and can assault civilians without consequences. Two uniformed Charlotte Mecklenburg police officers deliberately threw scalding coffee at a 22-year-old waitress and laughed while she screamed from second-degree burns covering 15% of her upper body. Their department cleared them within 72 hours to protect its own, despite video evidence from multiple angles showing obvious felony assault. I intervened because my PTSD and traumatic brain injury come from serving a country where we're supposed to believe authority comes with accountability, not immunity from consequences for criminal conduct. Ranger helped me manage symptoms severe enough that confronting armed officers who'd already demonstrated willingness to hurt civilians for amusement required every stress management technique and medical intervention I've learned in 2 years of intensive treatment. Research shows veterans with both TBI and PTSD face overlapping symptoms, including memory problems, anxiety, irritability, and cognitive challenges. But those disabilities don't diminish our observational skills, our credibility, or our obligation to stand up when we witness injustice. Watching police assault someone and laugh while their department protects them from consequences is exactly why many veterans with PTSD struggle to reintegrate into civilian society. We're told we serve to protect justice and democracy. Then we watch uniformed criminals use badges as shields while departments investigate themselves and predictably find no wrongdoing, regardless of evidence. Sometimes the most important use of military training isn't combat operations overseas. It's recognizing when authority becomes tyranny, when badges become licenses for cruelty instead of symbols of protection, and when someone needs a witness willing to remember that even disabled veterans with PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and service dogs who struggle daily with anxiety, cognitive challenges, and sensory issues have a duty to defend those who can't defend themselves against uniformed predators who believe their power makes them untouchable. Service doesn't end when you retire medically from the military. It just means finding new battles where accountability matters more than institutional convenience, where documentation defeats corruption, and where standing up costs something personally but matters infinitely more than the comfort of looking away while injustice happens in front of you.